Welcome to the Critical Hour. We're coming to you from the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C., here on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist, Dr. Wilmer Leon. I'm joined here by my co-host, political analyst, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
For the next 2 hours, we will explore and analyze the salient news stories that are impacting the global village in which we live. Sputnik International reports potential U.S. attack against Iran would trigger catastrophic effect on global economy. After a drone attack on a U.S. base in Syria near Jordan resulted in the deaths of 3 U.S. service members, President Joe Biden and other U.S. officials promised a strong response. Biden's comments have led to speculation that the U.S. may hit targets in Iran, which has long been a goal of neocons in Washington. How catastrophic would catastrophic be? Well, for insight, let's turn to our first guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So according to one of our regular guests, Mohammed Marandi, he says an attack on Iran would be catastrophic to the global economy. This, he believes, will prevent the U.S. from attacking Iran directly and will instead continue its attacks on Syria this would attack Iran directly, and that the U.S. will continue its attacks on Syria and Iraq. But he says he could be wrong. Your thoughts, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, this is a very complex and complicated moment with many variables. Certainly, an attack on Iran would open the gates of hell. Iran is a force and a power to be reckoned with. It's a major producer of drones, as we well know, which can easily reach U.S. troops in Iraq or in Jordan or illicitly in Syria, as the events of the past few days have suggested. On the other hand, an Iraq attack on Iran also would have a catalytic impact on the upward movement of oil prices. Now, that may be bad news for U.S. drivers on Los Angeles freeways, but for the titans of the oil industry in Texas, for example, it would be like manna from heaven. And that may help to explain why you have had these rather bellicose statements emanating from GOP presidential hopeful Nikki Haley, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, Lindsey Graham, the neocon from South Carolina, who's never seen a war he did not approve of, because they know more than most that the United States, in many ways, is the top oil producer and en route to becoming a leading, if not the top natural gas producer. And therefore, an attack on Iran, which could send oil prices spiraling, would send more dollars flowing into the pockets of their campaign donors. Now, fortunately, there is a split on the right, even the Republican right. The former Fox News host Tucker Carlson has poured cold water on the idea of an attack on Iran. The man in the pole position for the GOP nod for president, speaking of Donald J. Trump, has sent out messages on Truth Social that have lambasted Mr. Biden, but have not necessarily come out in favor of an attack on Iran. Perhaps he has paid attention to what is unavoidable, that Russia and China also have poured cold water on this idea. They, of course, are yoked to Iran through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which in many ways is a counterpoint to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization spearheaded by U.S. imperialism. Israel, of course, from the peanut gallery, is standing and cheering, hailing the possibility of an attack on Iran, because from its point of view, it's Iran that's supporting Hamas in Gaza. From their point of view, it's Iran that's supporting Ansar Allah, or the so-called Houthis in Yemen, and supporting Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, all of whom are presenting, in many ways, an existential threat to the future existence of Israel. And in that context, we know that Israel is a kind of loose cannon in U.S. politics, and yes, U.S. politics, because the Zionist lobby is no more than a cat's paw for Mr. Netanyahu. And recall that Mr. Netanyahu even had the gumption and the gall during the Obama years to come to Washington uninvited to address a session of Congress denouncing the so-called nuclear deal with Iran that Mr. Obama and his Secretary of State, John Kerry, had painstakingly negotiated. And so because of that particular dynamic, we cannot rule out a possibility for an U.S. attack on Iran, because, of course, we know that the Israeli lobby, the Zionist lobby, carries a lot of juice when it comes to influencing the Biden administration. Another factor to consider is that, according to the Wall Street Journal, relations between Israel and Egypt are declining and deteriorating sharply. Now, Egypt is a major power. It also is amply supplied by the U.S. military. It has a military that Israel would not want to go up against, but certainly that now cannot be ruled out. At the same time, Iran, as we know, also has a military that has to be reckoned with. And factor in here the recent trip to Ankara, President Raisi of Iran, which suggests that the so-called eastern flank of NATO, speaking of Turkey, will not necessarily be on board with regard to an attack on Iran, given the warming relations between the two Muslim giants. In this context as well, pay attention to what's happening in the United States of America with former Speaker Nancy Pelosi denouncing the pro-ceasefire movement with regard to Gaza, painting them all as dupes of Putin, painting others as dupes of the People's Republic of China. And recall as well that just this week, the African People's Socialist Party, under the leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela and the so-called Uhuru 3, who are now in the dock, supposedly because of their relationship to Moscow, they asked for charges to be dismissed, criminal charges, by the way, which would require doing hard time behind bars. Those charges were not dismissed, which is something that we all should be concerned about because, of course, they come for the Uhuru 3, and then they come for you and me, I'm afraid to say. The European Union, of course, is lost in the sauce. They are split with regard to foreign policy, and to an extent that's structural. For example, the European capitals, they tend to go their own way with regard to foreign policy and only unite on economic issues, but that's unsustainable because we now see that they cannot, they punch below their weight when it comes to foreign policy, which therefore has a detrimental impact upon their economic fortunes. In fact, you don't necessarily have to have a crystal ball to anticipate that if present trends continue, the mighty European Union, which has a market larger than that of the 330 million strong United States of America, could some ways become an appendage of U.S. imperialism, not only because it's dependent upon U.S. imperialism militarily to maintain, for example, France's neo-colonial empire in Africa, but as well it's dependent on U.S. imperialism for energy in light of its cutting off its nose to spite its face by turning against Russian energy and therefore turning towards U.S. energy. And then if you look at the German economy, the sick man of Europe, you see that its powerful automotive industry is being left in the dust, speaking of Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, by the rise of the Chinese automotive industry, which is now the leading auto manufacturer on planet Earth, led by BYD, which is eating the lunch of Tesla in the electric vehicle market. So all in all, with regard to the possibility of a U.S. attack on Iran, certainly given the correlation of forces I've just outlined, it cannot be ruled out. But if it's ruled in, it would certainly open the gates of hell.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Horne, from the perspective at home. In the event we've got an election year, there is the potential for, while the titans of energy will make a fortune, the voters will not be happy. And the people who are screaming from the right side of the aisle, the conservatives who are yelling to Biden, hey, make sure, go get them, go bomb them. When that goes bad, they'll be standing on the other side saying, boy, Biden's did a terrible job. Look at that, $10 a gallon. He has to go. So your thoughts on the considerations regarding domestic politics?
Well, the domestic politics in the United States presents another loose cannon type variant. For example, if you look at Nikki Haley, who basically has no path to victory in terms of winning the GOP nomination, she's being propped up by the 0.00001%. Notice her fundraiser just yesterday in New York City with the titans of Wall Street, including Kenneth Lagone. Recall that his name was on the medical school at New York University. Ken Griffith of Citadel Capital, who is contending with Elon Musk for being one of the richest people, if not the richest in the United States of America. But all that she can really do right now is wound the front runner, Donald J. Trump, which I think is one of the reasons why she's being propped up by these Wall Street titans. However, if you look at the Biden coalition, it too has its contradictions. Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase, the major Wall Street bank, thought to be in the Democratic fold. He's been issuing noises of late, sounding like a always Trumper, saying that Trump has been more right than wrong on NATO, immigration, China, etc. You saw the article in the New York Times the other day about how black clerics are quite upset with Genocide Joe's support for genocidal Israel and Gaza. We already know that Arab American voters in Michigan are not necessarily happy with Mr. Biden and do not plan to vote for him. And then there's this problem in my neck of the woods, which I don't think has received sufficient national attention, although I noted that Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, he said that he would not be surprised if civil war erupts in the United States. He's, of course, pointing to what's happening on the Texas-Mexico border, where there have been confrontations between Texas law enforcement and U.S. federal officials and the Border Patrol. Idaho, a red state, if you ever saw one, is sending armed men to the border to bolster their comrades in Texas and the so-called Army of God. I'm not speaking of some formation from West Asia or Lebanon. I'm speaking of these Christian evangelicals in the United States. They're heading to the Texas border along with right-wing truckers as well. It's a very volatile situation. It's a very explosive situation. It's no telling what impact it's going to have on U.S. domestic politics, but it can't be a positive factor.
Two quick questions. One, you mentioned Nikki Haley's fundraiser and you mentioned the titans of Wall Street that were there. Can you quickly explain, this seems to be a division within the elite within the United States in terms of the interest that Nikki Haley represents and the interest that Donald Trump represents. Can you quickly explain that schism on the right, and how can Joe Biden afford gas prices to go up as we're moving closer to November? Because as voters would have to ask themselves, am I better off today than I was last week? As energy prices would rise dramatically, the answer to that question would be no.
Well, Joe Biden certainly cannot afford a rise at the price of a gallon of gas at the pump. That's a no-brainer. Now, with regard to the split in the elite, certainly Nikki Haley does not have a stranglehold on the 1%. You can expect those like Bill Ackman, the Persian capital, who helped to chase Claudine Gay out of Harvard University, and who has been pounding on Mr. Biden to attack Iran. He, of course, is the self-designated captain of the pro-Israel lobby, a billionaire in good standing. You can expect him not to stand alongside Mr. Biden, and the same holds true for Mr. Elon Musk. But Mr. Trump has a base in the Euro-American working class and middle class who are quite happy with these attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion and affirmative action, and are, in return, are willing to cast a vote in favor of tax cuts for the 1%. From the diluted point of view of this Euro-American base, they feel that chasing Black people and other people of color out of certain positions will open up opportunities for their sons, their nieces, their nephews. And keep in mind as well that another Trump supporter, speaking of Charlie Sykes of Turning Point USA, said that he gets nervous when he gets on a plane and sees a Black pilot, believe it or not. And that's the kind of hysteria and ludicrous sentiment that increasingly is governing these United States of America.
So once again, they would rather vote their racism than vote their pocketbook.
Well, obviously, that's nothing new. That has been the case since 1865.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.